Thank you, Madam Toastmaster. Ladies and gentlemen, by a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the word benevolent? That's everyone, all right. How about the word irrational? How many have heard of that phrase, word? All right, cool. Now, final question, how many of you have heard of the phrase benevolently irrational? No one, all right. It's interesting that this phrase is unusual because it uses two words that are familiar to all of us. Yet when used together, they make a thoroughly unusual phrase. But unusual phrases are also thought-provoking phrases. And as communicators, we value thought-provoking phrases because they allow us to connect with our audience. Which is why tonight, I'd like to tell you a little bit about this phrase, benevolently irrational. Specifically, I'll describe what it means, where I first heard about it, and give you some examples of how you can use it. Now, at first glance, benevolently irrational almost sounds like a contradiction in terms. According to Webster's dictionary, the word benevolent means pertaining to or marked by doing good. But flip a few pages over in that same dictionary and you find irrational, and that means not governed by or according to reason. So they seem like very disparate concepts. But when you bring those definitions close together, you get a meaning that says goodness without reason. Goodness without reason, benevolently irrational. I first heard this phrase when I was watching a video online. It was titled, "Your Engagement Matters." You can find it at youtube.com if you're so interested. It was a talk given by a gentleman named Jefferson Smith. At the time, Mr. Smith was an Oregon state legislator. And his talk was about how democracy is possible, what makes it tick. One of his main points was that for democracy to work well, you need a group of people who not only advocate for themselves and their own interests, but for other people and their own interests. He called this group the Coalition of the Benevolently Irrational. The good people doing good things for no good reason. Goodness without reason. One member of this coalition, he noted in his talk, was a woman named Allison Belcher. She lived in Oregon, and she noticed that the city of Portland was thinking about taking a section of their city and expanding an existing roadway into a major highway. But she and others like her felt that that part of land, that piece of land, would be better used as a park where all of the citizens of Portland could come and enjoy it. So they launched a rather creative campaign to get the city leaders to give their project the green light, and eventually that's what happened. That park not only was successful, but it proved to be a turning point in civic planning in Portland. But the real kicker to the story is that Allison Belcher lived nowhere near that park. She was benevolent in that she advocated for something that a lot of people could benefit from, but it was irrational that she would be so focused on something that she wouldn't be able to enjoy herself. She was benevolently irrational. Now, Mr. Smith points out in his talk that doing nice things for other people isn't necessarily irrational. He called it, you could also use the term, big picture rationality. But as Toastmasters and as speakers, we like phrases that can hook an audience's attention, get them to really latch on to what we're thinking about and possibly spark a little creativity of their own. And benevolently irrational, because it's so unusual, is more likely to do that. That's where I heard the phrase. You can use this phrase any number of ways, not just for political advocacy, but in a number of contexts. One is if you're telling a make-believe story. For instance, imagine a tornado. If a tornado barrels through a town, and instead of ripping up fields and demolishing houses, it instead leaves behind freshly planted rows of geraniums and leaves every structure with a fresh coat of paint. That would be a benevolently irrational tornado. It's benevolent to plant flowers, it's benevolent to paint houses, it's thoroughly irrational for a tornado to do all those things. You could also use this phrase when you're describing very unusual acts. For example, a couple of nights ago, there was a baseball game in Queens, New York. If fans of the New York Mets decided to offer words of praise and encouragement, just shout them out from the bleachers toward the players of the Kansas City Royals, that would be benevolently irrational. It's benevolent to offer praise. It's irrational to do so toward the players of your opponents. The last context I'd like to share with you is describing random acts of kindness. One day, many years ago, I was traveling with my parents and siblings. We were in the family car on our way to San Francisco, and we were waiting at the Bay Bridge toll plaza. This was in the days before we had those fast-track transponders, in which we could just glide right through. This was also in the days of $2 tolls instead of $5 tolls. So we got to the toll booth, and my dad rolls down his window, and he prepares to pass over the money to the toll taker. But the toll taker says, "Nope, that's okay, sir. The car in front of you has paid for your toll too." All of us were stunned. Nothing like that had ever happened to us before. It's benevolent to have your toll taken care of. It's irrational for a complete stranger to do that for you. Someone we had never met, someone we would never get to meet, much less thank, but who nonetheless did a benevolent thing for us. So without missing a beat, my dad said, "Okay, would you mind using this money to pay for the toll for the car behind us?" And in turn, we got to be benevolently irrational. Overall, benevolently irrational is a rather unusual phrase, but it's one that is rather thought-provoking. It takes two words with seemingly different ideas and brings them together in a memorable phrase. I encourage you, if you get the chance, to use this phrase in different contexts, and I also hope that you too are the recipient of a benevolently irrational act. Madam Toastmaster.